Hello, everybody, and welcome again to The Sacred Life. I am your host, David Baylor, coming to you again. I'd like to welcome our special guests. We have Cleave to Antiquity here. Recently, Ben, that's right, your name is Ben, correct? Yeah, Ben announced that he is in the process of converting to Eastern Orthodoxy, which caused no small amount of stir on the internet, as some might imagine. Ben, why don't you tell us just a little bit? You don't need to go over your whole life story or anything, but just in case some of our audience doesn't know who you are, just give a brief introduction of yourself.
So when I was born, no, I'm just kidding. so,
What
so
time
I'm
of day was it, and what was the weather like?
yeah, exactly. It was exactly 9 p.m. on a weekday. No, yeah, no, my name is Ben. I was associate pastor at a non-denominational church. Was very involved in Protestant apologetics. Went on several different channels: Gavin Ortland, Ruslan's show, Redeem Zoomer, so on and so forth. Gospel Simplicity and other shows talking about Protestant apologetics. I would do debates. I would debate Roman Catholics, would debate Orthodox, would debate atheists, Muslims, whoever. And that's kind of what I had been doing for the last couple of years. Last year, I was doing it on YouTube, but I was asked by a friend of mine, Richard Redeem Zoomer, to come off of the. I was doing it on other platforms. He said you need to come on YouTube because nobody's doing Protestant apologetics well here. So I did that, and I had some success in that department. But ultimately, if you've seen the other interviews where I've talked about kind of my story, entering or seeking orthodoxy, and some of the things that led up to that, there were several factors that caused me to reconsider my position. And now here I am.
Yeah, well, I guess my first response to that would be praise God that you're finding your way to the church.
Right.
Obviously, I'm a proponent of that. I'm also a convert. Those who watch our channel know that. Our kind of background for our channel here is we're all former Mennonites, actually, and I think there's a pretty high degree of overlap theologically between the more non-denominational Protestants and the Anabaptist traditions. In a lot of ways, things like believers' baptism, then especially things like, I guess, iconoclasm being a strong tendency in both of those traditions. And so that's kind of one thing I wanted to talk to you about in this interview was kind of your experience coming from that world and encountering orthodoxy. I know that's a big question. It's really a big debate on the internet right now. What do we do about this icon question? Um, a lot of Protestants are really pressing us on this issue and forcing us to defend our position. Um, but it's really interesting to me to see the experiences of people, like myself, like yourself, coming from a place where, I can only imagine you would have been taught growing up, icons are idolatry in the Catholic Church, especially, having all of these statues and images. This is not biblical. This is something they've added to the faith. You don't worship God with images. That's false worship, which is idolatry. It's like the golden calf, all these kinds of arguments. And, at least I can say for myself, these are the arguments I always heard. And I believed a lot of these things and made a lot of these arguments myself. And so that was kind of a big deal in some sense for me and kind of not in other ways. Because like my experience encountering icons is like, if you don't deliberately try to see them as idols, it's kind of hard actually to. But I guess I'd like to hear a little bit of your, I don't know, your perspective on that from where you come from.
Sure. I mean, in my previous tradition, we were not iconoclasts, so it wasn't really too much of an issue with the icons themselves. I mean, even from the
Mhm.
beginning of my stream, I've had this icon at my desk. So
Mhm.
iconoclasm isn't a part of my Protestant tradition that I was kind of came up in, but I do hear that a lot from the Reformed crowd. And I think you're correct that in a lot of the low church evangelical settings, that is something that is typical. I think one of the hallmarks, though, of non-denominational Christianity is there's no unifying factor there. So you might have a diversity of beliefs depending on institution and traditional background.
Mhm.
I think the bigger thing to overcome would be veneration of icons rather than icons themselves, and having holy images, so on and so forth. So I think the veneration of icons would be something that would be a little bit of a different practice. But once you understand the concept of the communion of the saints, right, you have
Mhm.
especially when you get over that hurdle of understanding what the well, maybe not, because people will understand intercession of the saints, they'll just be opposed to it. But understanding why you shouldn't be so opposed to it, and then accepting that into your framework, then icon veneration becomes not so much of an issue from my perspective, because it's another way, to ask them to intercede, and then also just to show them respect. Which I don't know, if you were to look practically, right? Look at the way that any of the saints were ever remembered. Period. Point blank. What a great travesty to the Christian witness if we didn't have this practice of venerating
Mhm.
saints at all. We would have forgotten probably 99.9% of anybody who died for the faith. They would have been blips in history. Would have never remembered them. We wouldn't have had an opportunity to kind of learn from their example. That act of veneration, showing the respect to them that they deserve, is like, almost from a practical sense, it maintains that aspect of the faith, which I believe that's probably by providence, but um, it helps the future generations of Christians to follow the witness of the fathers, to follow the witness of even the more contemporary saints, so we can learn from their lives and from the things that they've gone through. But back to the concept, we're talking about icon veneration and kind of historicity of icons. There's a debate that's going on right now on X and other platforms regarding icon veneration, the historicity of icons, so on and so forth. This is normally stirred up by the Reformed camp. So Calvinists typically are very iconoclastic. Most Presbyterians will be iconoclasts. Some aren't, but most will be. Reformed
Mhm.
Baptists are typically iconoclasts. So like your Gavin Ortlund, Wesley Huff types, typically iconoclastic to an extent. But if you were to look just at an archaeological level, icons are very ancient. We have very, very early examples of icons. There was a good thread, which I don't know if I could pull this up on the screen. That might be cool. Um, yeah, let's see if we can do that. Maybe that might be interesting. This is from Michael Garton, who wrote a book called Early Christian Icons, and he shared a thread on X with several different early Christian examples of icon veneration and icons. So a couple of different examples. This was holy objects used in the sacraments. This was in the 300s. You compare and contrast the text with the modern Orthodox altar with many of the liturgical objects that were mentioned in the early 300s. This is one example. Another example would be holy images of Christ placed high up. Christ is the good shepherd, right? If you've seen that icon documentary, there's actually signet rings that show a figure venerating the Christ, the Good Shepherd icon. And these are from the 300s as well. So, relatively early examples of icon veneration. These are the older examples here on the ceiling of the catacomb churches. And then compare and contrast that with the modern Orthodox Church here.
Mhm.
So, archaeologically, we have many examples. I'll go to the more poignant because some of these were diagrams. This one was a more recent discovery, interactive participatory floor mosaic that has the ichthys fish here,
Mhm.
230 AD. This was underneath a jail cell, and they uncovered this, but this was actually an ancient private chapel, so it was used in worship in
Mhm.
230 AD. So, I mean, just from an archaeological perspective, we can see over and over and over again many examples of these icons all over the walls of the church, as you see here. This was extremely early as well. Many such examples showing respect to the priest, kissing the hand, that kind of a thing. Here's more wall mosaic pieces from 230 AD. So extremely early examples. This would be very difficult to make a historical argument against the practice of icon veneration. Now, what I've noticed in the popular discourse today is there's much equivocation over what exactly does veneration look like. Well, just because we see people venerating relics, like we have very early examples of relic veneration explicitly, right? Explicit details of relic veneration, um, uh, but they'll quibble about the words and they'll say, well, just because the icons happen to be in the same room, and it seems like the language says they were also venerating the icons. We're going to say they were okay with relic veneration, but not icon veneration. To me, it seems like you're splitting hairs. You know what I mean? I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
I think a big part of my observation, you know, I've kind of waded into I've kind of waded into this debate on X and other places a little bit myself.
Sure.
And especially like trying to pick the brains of these Protestants, these iconoclasts, to see what actually is their objection. And one thing I think I encounter a lot is they misunderstand what we intend with a lot of our terminology. So, like for example, where we talk about the icon being a window to heaven, or the honor passing through the image to the prototype. It seems like they hear this in this really technical sort of way, and they're hearing us saying that we are actually venerating the icon itself, or we are actually praying to the icon itself, or whatever it might be. Um, and it's this disconnect. Maybe in part I can say we could do a little bit of a better job of at times understanding how people are hearing our arguments, and try to present them in a way that goes around some of that confusion. Because when I read, like, for example, when I read St. John of Damascus, and he's talking about, like, in his defense of the holy icons, he's talking about this concept of the honor passing through the prototype, or passing through to the prototype. You know, he's also very clear to point out the icon is just a piece of wood, or he uses the illustration, the cross is you know, it's two pieces of wood, and if those two pieces of wood are not joined together in a cross, they're just two pieces of wood, and I'll throw them in the fire. And so he's saying, like, the image, like the object itself is not what is sacred and holy. And I think that is where I don't know, I think that's, to me, my impression is that's where a lot of this breakdown, a lot of this confusion occurs, is they do see on the surface this sort of idolatrous, like it seems to them to be this sort of idolatrous thing where we are saying, you know, like the icons back here is like an actual presence. You know, like, I don't know, to use like
Imparting your veneration to the object itself. Yeah. I
yeah,
mean,
right.
I would say that's probably not to say that things can't be blessed and be holy, but that we're not offering our veneration to the object itself. It's to what the object represents. So, if this is a depiction of Christ, my veneration, my worship in that instance would be going to Christ. If it
Yeah.
was an image of the blessed Theotokos, then it's my veneration going to the Theotokos, not to the object. Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's that hard of a concept for people to get over. I don't think it's an intellectual disconnect. I think normally where people get tripped up is the historicity of it, and they'll
Mhm.
say like, well, is we look at this language in the Old Testament where it talks about, don't make any image, in heaven or whatever, etc. But if you were to take the entire scripture in context, it's got to mean something, right? So, like,
Yeah.
what is God Himself an idolater when He commands, them to make the ark in a specific way, and it has the statues of the cherubim on it? It's got the images of the cherubim on the tabernacle curtains, and then they make the staff with the serpent to heal their sicknesses. So in each of these instances, is God Himself committing the same sin that He's asking us not to? No, obviously there was an
Right.
intent behind that. It was, don't do it like the pagan idolaters did in the Old Testament, where they're thinking these things are gods. Like, okay, is this, I don't know, let me just grab a random object. Is this box like a god? Am I making a god that I'm now going to worship? No,
Hmm.
that's not what the practice of icon
Well,
veneration is.
yeah, it's like, is this book a god? You know, this is a gospel book. Um, and just saying, like, the way Protestants venerate the scriptures, like, how is that different than how we venerate icons? The big point for me when we're talking about the historicity, so I did a couple streams this week, addressing what I consider to be myths about Saint Constantine and the Council of Nicaea, and this myth of Nicene or Roman Christianity. as being this kind of pagan or Greek philosophical compromise. And so it stops being true biblical Christianity after, that's what I would have learned growing up.
Right, right.
St. Constantine creates this compromise and forces the bishops of the church to adopt his ways of thinking, which is just historically untenable.
Correct.
But one thing I was doing was going through quote after quote after quote from church fathers, from the beginning, from figures like St. Ignatius, St. Irenaeus, and then going through the era of Nicaea, and then well afterwards, like all the way to the 14th century with St. Gregory Palamas, who is my own patron, where this constant theme that we see over and over and over again from pretty much every single church father is their staunch conservatism when it comes to the tradition of the church, and the high regard for which they hold they hold the apostolic tradition, the extreme emphasis they put on defending the apostolic faith, guarding against innovation, and that the ancient ways are the right ways, and so on and so on and so on. So, I just read a very small portion of the quotes that I have, and then the quotes that I have are probably a very small portion of the quotes that are out there. But so, like, when I'm looking at things like that, I see the values that these church fathers held. It seems a stretch for me to believe that they would have just quietly allowed something like icon veneration, if icon veneration is what the more iconoclastic people accuse it of being, or if it's this development that figures like Gavin Ortland try to characterize it. My question is, why do we not see any controversy until, like the 7th or 8th century? If it is what we expect, like, to me, it seems a much more defensive historical position to say, no, I have to believe that this practice was ancient at the time of the Second Council of Nicaea, ancient at the time of the iconoclasm, because prior to that, we just see no clear evidence of dispute. All we have are indirect quotes from various authors that can't even conclusively be demonstrated, and I would argue in every case actually are not aniconic or anti-iconic quotes. They're just being taken out of context and twisted to mean something else. And so, like, that's really my position on this historicity position, is like, well, if you're making that argument, there should be evidence that that's the case, and that evidence doesn't exist. So
Right.
you have at least as big of a hurdle in terms of historical evidence to clear as we do. And then add to that, I think it's often lost on people that haven't really dived into it, how extreme and how extensive the Diocletian persecutions actually were. And that, like, one of the central policies of Emperor Diocletian in his persecutions was the destruction of Christian texts, the destruction of Christian holy sites. We have things. I don't know if this happened during the persecutions of Diocletian, or if this had happened earlier than that, but things like the Romans building a pagan temple on the site of Christ's crucifixion and burial, where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is now. Just this very intense campaign that failed by the grace of God to destroy the church. And in light of that, if we're trying to argue about a lack of material evidence, it's like, well, you had the full resources of the Roman Empire dedicated to destroying Christianity. Like, what would you actually expect to find?
Yeah, I mean, I think even from the historicity aspect, you still find plenty of evidence to point towards uh, icon veneration in the first millennium, and then
Mhm.
especially early on. We just went over several examples. Granted, catacomb churches, right? The ones that maybe were a little more out of sight, out of mind for the Roman Empire.
Right.
But we do have very early examples. So I think it fails on all fronts. And one of the things that I found very interesting in this most recent controversy was that the Roman Catholics are now teaming up with the Protestants to try to attack the historicity of icon veneration. There was a gentleman since 33 AD, Kevin is his name on Twitter, and he had said that he believes icon veneration is not an apostolic practice; it was development.
Mhm.
So I've noticed this trend, especially within usually the Roman Catholic apologists, typically will make compromises of apostolicity to take jabs at the Orthodox, but it's at the expense of their own doctrine ultimately. Because if you were to look at the Second Council of Nicaea, Nicaea II, the argument it makes for icon veneration is that it's an apostolic tradition. So you're
Right.
basically de facto saying you reject Nicaea II, and I don't think you realize that, but my friend Gavin saw, at least I would consider him a friend still, saw the that post and retweeted it and was like, "Look, even the Catholics agree. Yeah, the icon veneration is not apostolic. You Orthodox are just kind of like crazy or something." I'm like,
Yeah.
it's shocking to me, but I mean, not really that shocking. You got to team up where you can, I guess. When especially in, I think I don't know if you've noticed the last 3 or 4 months, almost every debate that the Orthodox have had with Roman Catholics have been getting just absolutely demolished. The Roman Catholics have.
Mhm.
There was the Timothy Gordon debates that happened twice, right? There was the Trent Doherty debates that happened 3 times. So, well, once with me, I think once or twice with Jay question mark, and he debated apostate prophet once, and he lost all four, all four debates. So I mean, the Roman Catholics really haven't been doing that well. So I get like you kind of have to like they're like, okay, now we're going to team up with the Protestants a little bit. Orthodox guys are kind of mopping the floor with us. Jay's been doing a lot of heavy lifting. Oh, and then there was the Ubi Petrus versus Voice of Reason debate that went in Ubi's favor, I think, very well too. So we
Mhm.
see a consistent theme. I think we're probably going to continue to see, especially with some of the statements that Leo's making, because he seems to be following in the footsteps of like Francis as far as pushing synodality and maybe having some compromises on historical claims. So I think we'll see more and more of that from the Roman Catholic apologists as well.
Yeah, I have, I don't know, I could make some comments on there, but I'm always reminded of what my deacon says whenever he starts talking about the Catholics. He always stops himself and says, "Not my circus, not my monkeys," and then kind of backs out. So, like, I do, I like to try to avoid being overly polemical. Sometimes it's necessary, though. Like, you do have a good point. Um, my, like, in my own experience, like I was a student of church history well before I came to the Orthodox Church, and I would credit that with being one of the biggest contributing factors to my conversion to Orthodoxy. Is that in my knowledge of history, it's really the only historically consistent and tenable position. And then, like, especially studying the archaeology and studying the writings from the first millennium and finding that, well, this matches with what I experience in the Orthodox Church. This does not match. I've never been Catholic. I know quite a few people who are or have been, and I have family members that are Catholic. So I like to think I'm not completely ignorant of Catholicism, but I will admit I'm definitely not an expert by any stretch of the imagination. But what I do know, and what I do know, especially from the study of the medieval church, is that we do see this very clear progress of doctrine. If we're talking about things like papal supremacy, especially, like, you can trace this very clear progression of that doctrine through the late Middle Ages, um, and beyond, up until you get Vatican I papal supremacy and infallibility. And so things like that, I look at that historically and say, there's a clear development here. There's a clear inconsistency, and you do build a lot of your arguments as a Roman Catholic on quotes that you find from the first millennium, but you take those things and apply them in a way that is very clearly inconsistent with what was actually being said and what was actually happening at the time. And so I think there's at times kind of this disconnect. I don't know. I think I would add on top of that, like my own experience with knowledgeable Roman Catholics compared to knowledgeable Eastern Orthodox, is that knowledgeable Eastern Orthodox tend to know considerably more about history, whereas knowledgeable, this might be purely anecdotal. My experience might not represent the larger scale of things, but that is my experience. That I'm not talking about your average lay Roman Catholic who doesn't know much, but I'm talking about the people I know who really know their stuff. They're not super knowledgeable, especially on first millennium history, because it's not as important to them as it is to us. And so, like, things like this were major concerns to me, and one of the major reasons why I never really saw Roman Catholicism as a viable option.
Mhm. Yeah, I think I mean, I agree. I think most of in the apologetics world, it is mostly they're focused on their Thomistic and scholastic theology. So
Mhm.
if you debate a Roman Catholic, it's always going to be on their distinctions.
Yeah.
How do they square the circle of development? Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. Um, that has been my experience as well. I mean, we could talk about that ad nauseum, but I think the reason for bringing that up is to say that it is surprising to see them jumping into the fray on the side of the iconoclasts. So very odd. Not to say that he himself is an iconoclast, but
Mhm.
to jump in and to make statements that would support their position by denigrating apostolic tradition and saying it was actually a development, which is untrue.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I mean, we can address it from many different angles. I think if you're going to look at it from the philosophic position, right, you have to understand the distinctions between worship and veneration. You have to understand what's actually going on. Are we worshiping the object? No, that's obviously not the case. We're it's we're venerating the what it represents, who it represents. So if it's
Mhm.
the Theotokos, right, it would be the Theotokos. If it's
Yeah.
a certain saint, then it's that certain saint. We believe that we're actually in communion with them. They're actually a great cloud of witnesses that are aware of what's going on. So
Right.
I think those would be the steps to overcome. But from the Reformed perspective, I don't think it's a lack of knowledge, especially with some of the apologist guys out there. I don't think it's a lack of knowledge. I think it's a what you do with it, what you do with the knowledge. That's important.
Yeah, and I guess I'm not so much addressing the apologist as much as your everyday Protestant that you encounter. So if I am having a discussion with just your average Joe on X or out in the real world on the street and encountering their understanding of, let's say, somebody like Gavin Ortland's arguments against icons. I'll mention Gavin Ortland. I just think it's always important to qualify that I do have a lot of respect for him and for a lot of these other people, even if I disagree with them. I never want to make it sound like I'm picking on people.
Right. Yeah.
But just my experience with everyday people is that they listen to these Protestant apologists and they kind of run away with their arguments, and I think that's a lot of what most of our challenge as the Orthodox Church isn't online debates. It's how are we representing our faith to the everyday people, and that's kind of what I'm speaking to here. Is they they kind of halfway grasp these arguments and maybe come to some inaccurate conclusions based on that. So that's more what I was addressing. I think you're right, though. A lot of the higher end apologists do understand what we're trying to say. They just don't agree with it for whatever reason.
Sure.
Backing up to something you said earlier, where you're talking about if we didn't have icons, we didn't have icon veneration, there's so much that we would have lost in terms of knowledge of our own history. That's something I can relate to. My own tradition, the Anabaptist tradition, is one with a lot of respect of its own history, even if that history only goes back 500 years. It is a church of martyrs, and there is a kind of veneration that goes on of those martyrs. You do honor them, you do talk about them. in this very high way. You do hold them up as examples of what a Christian looks like, and this idea of Christianity as a suffering faith. So I was able to relate to all of that pretty easily, and that's something that helped bridge the gap for me for icon veneration. But connecting that with what you're saying, one thing I'm used to hearing from a lot of these apologists online who acknowledge now that yes, images existed in the church before Nicaea. You know, you can't deny that position anymore because there's just so much archaeological evidence. But then they try to say they were just didactic. They were just didactic, only for teaching. They weren't, you know, there's no veneration, which for one thing is what's actually the functional difference there. I think you're kind of inventing separate technical categories that don't actually exist in reality. But also, um, like interacting with the icons is is a very important way in which we learn our faith. You know, we're not strictly rational beings, and I think that's maybe a sort of misunderstanding that a lot of modernist people make when they're approaching this debate. You know, it's that we're taught, you know, if somebody's using a picture for teaching, what they're doing is they're pointing to a picture and then explaining it to you, as if it's just the rational experience that matters. And what I say is, no, we're not rational beings. We're partially rational beings, but we're also, you know, beings with body and sense, and all those things are very much involved in our, you know, our apprehension of the faith and our experience of the faith and of God. And icon veneration is a way in which that is embodied, a way in which that it manifests itself in our world. So I guess what I'm trying to get at there is icon veneration is natural, in a lot of ways necessary.
Mhm.
And I think if you can understand that concept, you understand better the arguments being presented at the Second Council of Nicaea.
Yeah, and I think it also helps you to understand the incarnation, which was the arguments put forth there as well.
Mhm.
But it's supposed to be, I mean, icons are supposed to be, especially when you're depicting like angels, so on and so forth. It's to give you an insight as to what is seen in the unseen realm,
Right.
right? So there is a spiritual aspect. Yeah, we have sense data, you know, that we process just like, you know, any other, like you said, rational being in part, but also spiritual. So it's not, a lot of times I think people from the Protestant perspective, because Protestantism is a product of the Enlightenment. Ultimately, the philosophy of the Enlightenment carried over, and that is ultimately seeped into a lot of the different institutions within Protestantism. So they might approach things from more of a, if you're familiar with philosophy, maybe like a skeptics perspective, maybe a
Mhm.
more rationalist, materialist perspective. So the mystical aspects of theology often are lost in translation when we're discussing with Protestants. And that's one of the things where people will say, you know, you have to come and experience, you have to have your noose opened, you have to experience the life of the church, you have to attend the divine liturgy, you have to really interact with these things to know. There is some truth to that, because you do need to, like we were saying, you might be able to have all the information, like some of the apologists, like you had mentioned earlier, but maybe they disagree for whatever reason. Sometimes that information is dead information. It needs to be brought to life. And the life of the
Mhm.
church can certainly help to do that as you interact, like you said, with the icons, with the divine liturgy, with
Right.
participating in the life of the church, and you begin to undergo theosis. There's a text, the mystical theology of the Orthodox Church by Losky, that kind of covers the way that your theology, even if you were to take one piece out, it has ramifications downhill. It will impact just about every facet of how you understand the faith. If you were to take icon veneration out of the entire mosaic, there are all sorts of ramifications that you would run into. You don't have a great defense for, you know, a physical incarnation. You might be more susceptible to a heresy like the Docetists or something, you know, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with that historical controversy, but basically it was like, um, no flesh, like a spiritual incarnate, like
Mhm.
because the ancient pagans were like, Oh, it's the demiurge's fault. The flesh is bad. We have to escape the flesh. Therefore, Jesus couldn't have flesh. It's like a crazy heresy if you think about it. But from the mindset of the cultural context of early paganism, it made complete sense to them in their philosophy. They're like, oh yeah, flesh bad, Jesus
Mhm.
good, therefore no flesh. So without icon veneration, there are a lot of things that would be affected downhill from there. And we do see that today,
Yeah.
actually. We do see that within the Reformed camp. And we do see that within the way that even look at the modern state of our architecture, right? The countries that have taken a more reformed position and they are more iconoclastic, look at the way that their architecture has developed. Look at the
Yeah.
way that our architecture is now in modern contemporary churches. It's not full of art. It's not meant to draw you up. It's meant to keep you here and now, so you focus on whatever message is being delivered. Whereas in an Orthodox church, the intent is to draw you upwards towards God. It's all intentional. It's not accidental. So Losky was absolutely correct. You take one piece out, there are a wave of ramifications that follow. So I think it is super important, and I definitely think you see the fruits of a lack of that. I said this in a interview that I did not that long ago. If I have you ever read the Screw Tape Letters by C.S. Lewis?
I haven't. I want to. I remember when my dad was reading it, and he was basically narrating the whole book to us.
Yeah,
So
I'll give you
I'm
I'll
fairly
give you the
familiar with it.
I'll give you the premise, and also for those that are watching that aren't familiar with the book. But basically, it's like there's two demons that are writing back and forth. They're writing letters, and they're trying to tempt a guy, like a Christian guy,
Mhm.
and they're going about different ways of tempting. It's like, oh, that didn't work, and then the uncle's giving the other demon advice on how to tempt the guy. So it's like a treatise on spiritual warfare. So sometimes I think I'm like, if I was Screw Tape, one of the things that I would do is be like, remove all beauty from the churches. That would be a good way, I think, to destroy people's faith. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, so going back to what you're saying about Docetism, and you kind of mentioned this already, but there really is this low level Docetism that is kind of pervasive in our modern, our modern pop Christianity that we see all around us, where it goes back to the Reformation, especially with figures like John Calvin. I don't know if you've ever read his
Yeah.
Psychopanachia, where he basically presents this Docetist, or what I think of as more of a Platonic or Origenist notion of the relationship between the body and the soul, and where he outright says the body is a prison of the
Mhm.
soul that we escape at death,
It's the
which is like
demiurge.
that's not Christianity, that's
Yeah, yeah.
paganism.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
but so this is something that is definitely uh, very firmly in the minds of people in reformed traditions, even if it's kind of latent and they don't talk about it directly. It's uh, definitely a key concept, and I think that's important when considering iconography. Is one of the things that is central to this debate is our understanding of what Christianity is about. And I think for Reformed Protestants, Christianity is fundamentally about escaping this world that we see as evil and as a prison in this almost like pseudo Gnostic sense or like a
Mhm.
pagan sense. And in contrast, in Orthodox Christianity, what we say is no, um, the world as God created it is good, and it is corrupted by evil. And what you mentioned earlier with things being holy, I like the explanation of that what a holy thing is really something that has been purified, like
Sure.
something that so like I remember my priest describing holy water as real water.
Mhm.
So it's not that this water has been granted magical properties, or like some kind of magic ritual has made this, given it superpowers or something like that. It's like, no, it's real water. It's water that's no longer corrupted by the taint of sin and death and evil. And if we understand that concept, we understand a big part of why we have icons is because heaven is invading earth. And
Mhm.
this beauty is is supplanting the ugliness of sin and death.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting way to frame that. That within Reformed theology, again, is not indicative of all Protestantism, but those particularly who hold to Reformed theology, it is kind of like we're just trying to escape this plane and move on to the next because
Mhm.
we're basically in bondage. Our wills are corrupted, so on and so forth. Now, granted, they're not going to admit to you that that is the underlying framework, but ultimately that is that's a pretty interesting insight that it is a pseudo kind of like we have to escape the demiurge kind of deal. It's very
Mhm.
interesting. Yeah, I like that because especially if you were to look at like the view the view of the atonement, it's like we have to escape the punishment. Like it's like escape, 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 escape.
Mhm.
Whereas within Orthodox theology, it's we have to heal, we have to heal, we have to heal.
Right.
It's medicinal. It's medicinal. Even the even Christus Victor would be like more medicinal. It's overcoming death. It's offering us theosis. It's offering us these ways to be healed of our infirmities, rather than simply. Yeah, that's an interesting insight. It's like I have to escape, escape, escape from the Reformed perspective, whereas in the Orthodox, it's like, well, no, we have to heal. So yeah,
Yeah.
I think that is an interesting paradigm. I think you're spot on with that.
Yeah, I remember the first time I attended a liturgy at what is now my parish. Um, Actually, it was the first 2 or maybe even 3 times that I attended the liturgy there. Um, our priest, who's now my priest, mentioned something in the homily about the church being the place of healing,
Hmm.
or like the hospital of souls and that kind of language. And I just remember thinking, like, yes, this is what it's supposed to be. And I think that that distinction plays itself out in the concepts that these different traditions have of salvation. And so one thing that really, I guess, kind of sticks in people's side when we're talking about icon veneration or the veneration of the saints in Mary is the anathemas of the councils, especially the anathemas in the Second Council of Nicaea against the iconoclasts. And they read the anathemas as if we're saying, if you don't venerate icons, you're going to hell. And if they extend that also, like for example, we would say there's no salvation outside of the Orthodox Church. So they understand that as we're saying everybody who's not Orthodox is going to hell, which is not what we're saying, but you would understand it that way if you have this kind of paradigm that we're talking about, where instead of understanding salvation as healing of the soul and the body ultimately, um, you understand it as escape from punishment, escape from this world and its and the judgment that awaits it, escape from the wrath of God. Then what we're saying is, oh, if you don't venerate icons, then God will judge you for that, and you won't escape His wrath. Or if you're not in the Orthodox Church, then you're in the world and you're going to share in its damnation. Like, and that's not what we're saying. What we're saying is you're putting this barrier between this unnecessary barrier between yourself and the healing that Christ so freely offers to you in his church.
Hmm. I think a good way to understand, because anathemas is something that I've covered on my channel quite a bit, especially when I was a Protestant, using some of the language of the ecumenical councils. Whereas, like, if you were to read the minutes of Nicaea 2, it says, now anathema is nothing less than complete separation from God. That's one of the
Mhm.
definitions from Nicaea 2.
Right.
But you have to understand exactly what it's talking about when it's talking about that separation. Is it saying that God is like somehow bound to this institution and cannot operate outside of it? Is that what it's saying? Is God contained in a little box and you can only find this box within the Orthodox Church? That's not necessarily the best way to articulate that at all, nor is it true. I would say it was easier for me to understand it by following this line of reasoning. If you were to read John 6:53 through 60, it says a couple of things about the Eucharist. It's necessary. Okay. If you do not participate in it, right, you have no life in you. if when you do participate, I will abide in you, you will abide in me. That's John 6:53 through 60. So you can look at a couple of those things, tie that into apostolic succession. You look at Matthew 16:18, where he promises to give the keys, and then Matthew 18:18, when he gives the keys to all the apostles. So all of the apostles receive the keys. Okay, so what happens after that? Do they get handed on to their successors? Yes. Look at Acts 1, the beginning of Acts, when Judas has passed away and they elect Matthias as the next apostle. So this authority to actually have valid sacraments is handed to the apostles and their successors. So if you want a valid Eucharist, you have to be within the church. And that's the church that Christ established, the church that was handed down to the apostles. That is the Orthodox Church. So I mean, you can look at several statements by patristics, early church fathers, that will say that, you know, if you schism, right, that affects having valid sacraments, so on and so forth. So you can put Rome off to the side because one patriarchate that breaks off from the other four. You know, because we don't necessarily say that they have valid sacraments. If you want to have the sacraments, you have to be a part of the Orthodox Church. That's normative for salvation. That's not to say that God can't operate outside of the sacraments, but that would be kind of an exception, and we don't judge individual salvation on that basis. What anathema is doing is it's saying who is and isn't within the church, right? It's setting the boundaries of Christendom, which is saying if you are outside of this, okay, you're outside of the normative saving grace that Christ gives us and is imparted by the church. So no salvation outside of the church, understood by that lens, I think may help to clear up for some Protestants that are struggling with that, because they just, like you said, yeah, they're thinking about it black and white. They're thinking one sin separate me completely from God. Like this is like if you're like a super scrupulous person that reads the Bible for the first time, you might think of like the unforgivable sin and pocket watch yourself. Like, did I commit it yet? Did I commit it? Is it over for me? You know? So I think you're right. I think that they are looking at it from a black and white paradigm rather than this is healing. You want the medicine, come in. Like, you know, you may be able to heal from just, I don't know, completely shattered ribs by laying on the forest floor out there. But wouldn't you rather come in and see the doctor and have it addressed? You know, that might be an exception. You're probably going to die.
Yeah. Well, there's one thing that helps me understand this distinction, understand this concept, I should say, which is that, you know, we have the doctrine as Orthodox of the harrowing of Hades and Christ
Sure.
descending to hell. And one thing that really struck me, I remember when I was a catechumen in our catechesis and we were talking about that. And it just really struck me that, you know, kind of the definition of what hell is the separation of God or separation from God. And, you know, so sort of when we're saying anathema is the complete, like it's nothing other than the complete separation from God, we are saying separation from the church is kind of an experience of hell in a lot of ways. But when Christ was crucified and descended into death, into Hades, into hell, God entered into, I don't know quite how to say this, other than God entered into the one place where God was not. I mean, I don't know if you track what I'm trying to say here, but what it suggests to me is that saying somebody is separate from God, since we have Christ who has overthrown death and hell, that's not the same thing as to say they are damned to eternal hell and torment, because God can still reach them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that gets into a bigger, that might muddy up the picture a little bit. I think if we were to take that, if we were to go that line of reasoning, I think it might muddy some things up. I mean, I get what you're saying with the harrowing, right?
Mhm.
I'd say typically when I'm talking about the harrowing of hell, you know, which is a translation from Hades, which is Sheol, so on and so
Right.
forth. But if we're talking about that theological concept, usually I will use that to explain how there was any hope for those in the Old Testament because they heard
Yeah.
the gospel preached to them. It says in says multiple times in the scripture that he spent 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the earth, just as Jonah spent 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the whale. Also that he just sent, so on and so forth. He made proclamation to the spirits in prison is another statement in the
Right.
scriptures. So I think understanding the cross as conquering death, right, gives you a proper view of the harrowing of hell and why that was necessary, right? It's
Yeah.
not as though God was some sort of like the Nestorian paradigm isn't true. There wasn't like a schizophrenic break in the natures, and it was like, oh well, now Jesus is actually damned by the Father or something. Like
Yeah.
some kind of interesting, weird articulation of PSA, which some people will debate about. But understanding it as defeating death, then the harrowing is a necessary component, especially in theology, which, interestingly enough, we were talking about the Reformed quite a bit. John Calvin explicitly rejected the harrowing of hell. So
Mhm.
it probably had to do with his black and white paradigm, like you're suggesting earlier. So all of these things interweave together. One piece missing, right? You've got the idea of the atonement being skewed. Can lead into several other breaks in doctrine later down the line, or even how you view these things. So I think Losky was really onto something when he was writing mystical theology. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess when I'm talking about hell, the concept I have in my and hell and the separation from God and all of these things, the concept I have in my mind of these things is not like hell is this separate place, or like this, I don't know, this fiery, all this language is used kind of symbolically, allegorically to represent it, but all it really means is death. And what is death? Death is the absence of life. It's the separation of life from the body. And and what is life? Life, like Christ is the life.
Mm.
And so I think this is like, you do find this in patristic literature where they do understand that well, what death and hell are the separation from God, who is the life. And so that's kind of what my thinking is there. And I guess the main point I'm trying to bring out with that, though, is that since the Orthodox Church does not have this really black and white paradigm, to say that somebody is anathema, or to say that somebody is cut off from salvation, does not mean anything close to what that means for a Calvinist.
Right, because it's a state of being, right, in the
Mhm.
eschaton. It's how are you reacting to the presence of God? Like on one end, if you're impure, you're gonna die. The example of the ark, right? You're not supposed to touch it, or if you were to enter into a specific area, or if you were to offer your sacrifices unworthily, or we just look at the Eucharist, which is Christ's presence there. People that participated in it unworthily, they got sick, they died, right? So you can kind of look at it is kind of how you're reacting to the presence of God in that instance, right? So if you're in a state of theosis, if you have gone through that process, it'll be a joyful healing experience. If you're not, it's going to basically be eternal death. You know what I mean?
Right. Well, yeah, because it's like, um, I always liked this image that Jordan Peterson used to use about, you're mostly dead wood, and in order for you to become a real living person, all of that dead wood has to be burned out. And if you're like 99% dead wood, that is not going to be pleasant. And that kind of imagery helps me understand what theosis really is, and
Mhm.
why we speak of eternity and salvation as Orthodox in the way that we do. Is like, no, our progress in life is determining our eternity, because if I am progressing towards God and stripping the sinfulness away from myself and becoming more and more like Christ, then that is what remains when all of that sinfulness and evil is burned away. And if all I am is sin and evil, then that means all there is for me is burning,
Right.
is that torment. And it's like because once that's burned away, there's just nothing left of me. Um, and one reason why I really like that way of looking at it, in contrast to this flip a switch salvation, is because it's actually useful to me. Right? Like, it's useful to me right now. It means something to me right now. It's something I can wrap my mind around, I can understand, I can do something with it. I can look at that and understand, no, my life is about participation with God's energies, with his grace,
Mhm.
so that I can be transformed and made like him, like Christ, which is what theosis is. Um, I'm not sure exactly how we got there from from talking about icons, but they are related because that is a central concept as to why we have the icons. Connecting that back to what you were saying again. I really like this. This is, I think, why I keep going back to it, where you were talking about what we would have lost if we didn't have the icons. And a big thing that we would have lost is the evidence of the truth of God's word throughout history. The clear witness of what that actually looks like. And a big thing for me is, if I don't honor the Theotokos, if I don't honor the saints, then I'm not honoring God, because I'm dishonoring his ministers, the ministers of his will. I know I'm dishonoring what he has done. And so to me, it seems very natural that I would put images of his saints and images of the stories of the things that he has done in the work of salvation for me and for the world in prominent places, because that is a way of paying honor to God, and also a way of patterning, like having the icons here and praying in front of those icons every day
Mhm.
is patterning my life as a life that honors God and honors the work that he has done. And to me, the more I encounter that, the more it just doesn't make sense that I wouldn't do that.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I completely agree. It sets the pattern, and also having, I mean, I was kind of used to the more like liturgical prayer style, because I use the Book of Common Prayer already in my
Mhm,
prayer life. But having that, set, you're doing your morning prayers, you're doing your evening prayers, and you are starting and ending your day with Christ, I think is super important, and is something that is missing from the vast majority of Western Christianity. Absolutely.
mhm. Yeah, we're running pretty close to our hour here. It's probably good to start wrapping up. I
Yeah,
don't know if you
sounds
had
good.
anything more you wanted to say.
No, I mean, I could plug a couple of things if that's cool, and then we can wrap up.
Yeah, and I can plug a couple things when you're done plugging your things too. So
Cool. So if anyone wants to follow the channel that I run is called Cleave to Antiquity. You can probably see my name right there. It's
yeah.
spelled exactly like that. I'll have some neat guests on. So I'm taking a different approach on my channel. I'm doing mostly interviews. So I'll have people coming on the show to teach Orthodox theology, whether it's a priest or it's so on and so forth. And maybe if I have questions, I'll ask them, that kind of thing. And then we'll do Q&A streams and stuff like that. So that'll be interesting. This Friday, the 17th, I'll have Craig Truglia on. We're going to be discussing the topic of icons. So that'll be interesting. Just what we're talking about now. It's a hot topic. So a lot of people are discussing it. On the 21st, Jay will swing by and he'll do a Q&A for us. So if you want to ask him some questions, feel free to tune in on that date. And then on the 24th, Father Deacon Ananias will come by to do a Q&A stream. So I really like doing the Q&A streams. I think they're fun. Just fielding a whole bunch of questions on, like, sometimes it's like something I never thought about. Like sometimes I'll get a really interesting one. Now they're kind of few and far between. Some of the stuff is stuff that's been addressed like 500 times. But sometimes you'll get one you're like, huh, that's an interesting, like, just the way their brain works kind of opens up new avenues to thinking about things theologically. It's a treat. It's a blessing to be able to participate in those. And I really appreciate this interview. I think that that bit of insight that you gave about Reformed theology and that underlying current of just like a black and white paradigm versus, really an experiential medicinal paradigm from our perspective. I think that's super helpful
Mhm.
to realize. But thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. The Q&A streams are a lot of fun. Obviously, I don't have the following that you do, and I just started doing live streams 2 days ago, so I don't have a whole lot of activity. But I just decided one thing I'd like to do is have maybe half an hour, 45 minutes of talk on a subject, and then follow that up with just live Q&A for anybody who's in the chat on the YouTube stream. And,
Right.
and that's fun. I like that. I think it's good to give the audience a chance to be more involved, ask their questions, um, and not just be talking heads sitting here yapping at people all the time. This topic about iconography, yeah, it is a huge thing that's just blowing up right now. I think part of the reason it's blowing up is because actually uh, we're winning in a lot of ways.
Mm,
Um, it's also something that's really, I guess I'm pretty personally, I'm personally invested in it in a pretty big way. Actually, all these icons behind here, I painted myself. I'm actually an apprentice iconographer, so
yeah.
I took a pretty far jump from being an iconoclast Mennonite to now being an Orthodox iconographer. I'll have links to my iconography, my website, in the description in this video when it posts. So if you're watching this, you can check that out. If you, my illustrious guest here, maybe I should. Maybe I should like give you a gift of an icon or something, and you can put it in the background of your video. Free advertisement or something, right?
I'm trying to set
Um,
up a PO box. I don't have one right now. I used to receive like all the packages from the YouTube stuff at my church office, but obviously I'm not using that
yeah,
anymore as a
right.
place to send stuff rather than like hand out like my home address and then I've got people showing up knocking at my
Mhm.
door or something. Yeah, but eventually I'll get a PO box set up and I'll probably put that somewhere and say like if people want to send me something, they
Yeah,
can send it there. Probably safer to do it that way too, because they screen the stuff, like,
yeah.
you never know. Some people online send me like a something crazy in the mail or whatever. You're like I'm always cautious about that in the online space because I'm like, dude, I've seen what people say in the comments. I'm not so sure if I want to make everything so
Yeah,
public or give my address to somebody and then they like, I don't know, share it to a body that's least less uh you know, private about things. But anyway.
yeah. Yeah, I definitely, if you're watching this, you don't follow Cleave to Antiquity, go over there, follow his channel. I think you can find him on X under the same name, right?
Yeah.
Um, I'm on X too, but barely. So I don't care if you follow me or not. Uh, but you can find links to, like I said, to my iconography website. I appreciate it if you'd follow this channel if you haven't already, or subscribe to this channel. Sorry, getting my platforms mixed up in my mind here. Um, and we also have links for I have an Instagram for my iconography. That's linked in the description. Will be linked in the description there as well. And we have a Patreon. People can follow our Patreon. I don't know if you have anything like that where people can help support you in your ministry.
I just do the members program on YouTube, but
Okay.
really, I mean, a lot of the members doesn't really do much for me monetarily. I mostly do it just so people that want to support have a little extra content that they can interact with.
Yeah.
The best way to support, I would say, is if you want to contribute something on PayPal, I have that available. But also, I mean, just watching the stuff and super chatting when you can, that's more than appreciated. Other than that, though, that's really the only way.
All right. Um, And then I always want to remind our audience, we are kind of in pre-production. We're doing an animated series to tell the lives of the saints. Still working on the logistics and putting our team together for that. But just kind of want to keep everybody reminded that we are doing that. It just takes a lot of work in the background to launch a project like that. So stay in touch, keep track of us as announcements come forward. Hopefully we'll have something out soon in terms of a kind of a trailer for that. I hope we can get that done by the end of the year, but we'll just kind of have to see how everybody's schedules work out. I guess that's it for this episode of The Sacred Life. I'd like to thank Ben from Cleave to Antiquity again for joining us. I thought it was very good conversation that we had here today. And thanks to everybody who has watched to the end. Hope that you will join us next time. And if you're not following Cleave on X, don't subscribe to him on YouTube. Go ahead and jump over there and do that as well. So until next time, I'll once again wish you all peace in Christ.